What if the Gentiles that the Apostle Paul was writing all his letters to weren't actually who you think they are?
Right.
Like, what if they weren't just these random non-Israelites who, just happened to stumble into a brand new faith?
It completely changes the narrative.
It really does. And what if the famous phrase Jesus uttered on the cross, "It is finished," what if that had absolutely nothing to do with canceling the Ten Commandments? What if it was actually the legal settlement of a massive ancient divorce decree?
I mean, that right there is a massive paradigm shift.
Oh.
Because if you misidentify the audience of those letters, or if you misunderstand the actual legal mechanism of what was happening on that cross, you fundamentally misread the entire purpose of the new covenant.
You completely miss it. And that is exactly where we are going today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We have a fascinating and, frankly, an incredibly dense stack of source material today.
Very dense.
Yeah. We are looking at this exclusive, highly detailed set of study notes compiled by an individual named Kenneth. And these notes, they were brought in to basically scrutinize the validity of what modern theology teaches about the new covenant.
Yeah.
And while according to Kenneth's research, the mainstream narrative most of us grew up hearing is, it's just miles away from the truth.
It is a profound departure from the norm. And our goal here today is to impartially walk through Kenneth's thesis. So for the listener, the notes are intended as a basic entry-level introduction for someone trying to understand what the new covenant actually is, based on these very specific historical and textual parameters.
Yeah.
But I want to be very clear for anyone listening right now, when the notes say entry-level, they do not mean shallow.
Oh, definitely not. No.
Right. This is meat, not milk, as the text would say. It requires a willingness to look at these documents, much like the noble Bereans did in the book of Acts.
Right. Because the Bereans, they were commended because they didn't just passively accept what they were told, right? They searched the scriptures daily to see if the claims held up. And that's the exact mindset that Kenneth's notes really demand from you as the listener.
It's an active study, for sure.
But before we even get into the specific claims, I noticed there's a really strict filter that Kenneth applies to this entire study. He calls it a 13-point scripture master charter.
Yes.
And the very first rule, which acts as this kind of global umbrella for everything we're about to talk about, is that we have to completely toss out what he calls modern hermeneutics.
Yeah, the methodology is central to understanding his entire argument. In these notes, modern hermeneutics is essentially characterized as theological gymnastics.
Theological gymnastics. Okay, like gymnastics in what sense? Like stretching a verse to fit a specific agenda.
Exactly that. The notes argue that modern interpreters often use proof texting, pulling a single verse completely out of its historical setting. Or they literally change the definitions of Greek and Hebrew words mid-sentence just to fit a preconceived denominational bias.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Kenneth's 13-point charter is presented as an antidote to that. It prioritizes original languages, ancient legal history, and most importantly, above all else, the unchanging nature of the Creator.
Okay, so let's test that first rule right out of the gate. The unchanging nature of the Creator, or what theologians call divine immutability.
Right.
Kenneth argues that if God's character fundamentally cannot change, then his requirement for holiness cannot just be retired or sunsetted without the deity himself changing.
The logic here is incredibly tight.
Yeah.
In the ancient world, holiness wasn't just this vague, warm feeling of piety, It fundamentally meant separation.
Like drawing a line in the sand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It meant drawing a stark line between what is sacred and what is common or profane. Now, according to Kenneth's thesis, modern theologians often claim that this strict boundary of holiness was just a temporary national requirement just for the ancient nation of Israel.
Right, like an old covenant thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Kenneth points out that this is a failure of both basic logic and textual analysis.
Yeah, and I see that in the notes right here. He pulls up 1 Peter 1, verses 15 and 16. Peter is writing to New Covenant believers, and he explicitly quotes the old Levitical mandate.
He does?
He says, "But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy." So Peter is pulling straight from Leviticus. He's not saying, hey, Jesus came, so now we can just relax and blend in with the culture.
No, he is doubling down on the original standard. And the notes bring in a second witness to support this, 1 John chapter 3.
Okay.
John links the status of being a son of God with the active, ongoing process of purification. John literally writes that everyone who has this hope purifies himself even as he is pure.
Wait, let's pause on that word pure for a second, because I know a lot of people today, you hear pure and you think of it purely as an internal, invisible status.
Right.
Like, oh, God sees me as pure even if my actions aren't. Does the original language actually support that?
That's a great question, and it's exactly where Kenneth's charter demands we look at the Greek. John uses the word hagnos for pure.
Hagnos.
Right. And in the first century context, hagnos is functionally synonymous with hagios, which means holy.
Oh, interesting.
It is an active state of being separated from defilement. Kenneth argues that John is explicitly tying the new covenant state of being to the active process of matching the divine standard. If the mandate is purify yourself as he is pure, then that standard is tethered to the eternal character of the Creator, not just to a specific historical era.
So it's an eternal baseline. It doesn't shift.
Exactly.
And there's a verse here in Hebrews that Kenneth uses as a supplemental witness. And honestly, if you take it at face value, it's pretty terrifying.
Hebrews 12, right?
Yeah, Hebrews 12.14 says, follow peace with all men and holiness without which no man shall see the Lord. I mean, that does not sound like a gentle suggestion.
No, it's framed as a functional requirement.
Yeah.
The mechanics the notes outline here are completely binary. No holiness equals no access. Yeah. Kenneth's argument is that mainstream theology tries to separate the benefits of the new covenant,
Yeah.
like forgiveness and grace, from the obligations of the new covenant, which are transformation and obedience.
Right. They want the reward without the work.
Exactly. But logically, if the new covenant is defined as having the law written on the heart, and that law is exactly what defined holiness in the first place, well, it becomes impossible to participate in the new covenant without the actual manifestation of that holiness.
Okay, I hear you, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
If the original law was so perfect and it perfectly reflected God's character, why did it fail? I mean, why is the Old Testament just filled with stories of Israel constantly rebelling and failing to keep it? If the software is flawless, why did the system crash?
That is the core paradox. And Kenneth's notes introduce a really fascinating concept to address it. He calls it the dual law problem. We have to distinguish between what God calls my law and what he calls your law.
Your law. Wait, why does he say that?
Okay, so when the deity speaks of his ideal standard, for instance, in Jeremiah 31, the Hebrew text uses Torati, which means my law or my instruction.
Torati, okay.
But by the time you get to the prophets, like Isaiah chapter 1, the people had so corrupted the original instructions with traditions and hypocrisy that God actually distances himself from it. He says things like, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. Notice the pronoun shift there.
Oh, it went from my to your.
Exactly.
Ah, I see. And Kenneth notes this happens heavily in the Second Temple period, right? Like during the time of Jesus.
Yes, very heavily. The religious leaders of that era believed they needed to build a fence around the Torah to protect it. So they enacted what are called takanot.
Let's slow down on that word. What exactly is a takanot?
Takanot are legislative enactments. They are man-made laws, traditions, and loopholes created by the rabbis to supposedly safeguard the original commandments. But over time, these additions became incredibly burdensome.
Right.
They essentially became an entirely secondary law code. This is what Jesus is attacking when he speaks to the Pharisees in Mark chapter 7. He tells them, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition.
Wow.
Yeah, so Kenneth argues that the law that was failing wasn't God's original law, it was the corrupted, man-made version of it.
I'm trying to picture this. What if we looked at it like a software ecosystem?
Okay.
So God provides the original flawless source code, that's his law, the Torati, but Israel, acting as the system administrators, decided the code needed some updates. So they started adding their own unauthorized mods.
Right.
They add all these takanot, these buggy lines of code, until the whole system becomes bloated and eventually crashes.
That's a very helpful way to visualize it.
So if I'm tracking with Kenneth's thesis here, the new covenant isn't God throwing up his hands and saying, well, the original source code was bad, let's delete it and write something entirely new.
Not at all.
He's just taking back the administrative rights. He's stripping away all the user-generated mods and reinstalling the pure system files directly into the hardware.
Yes. And Kenneth uses an ancient legal concept to explain why Israel never actually had the right to alter the code in the first place. The concept is called usufruct.
Usufruct? That sounds like a terrible piece of fruit. What does that mean in a legal context?
It does sound strange. In ancient property law, usufruct is the right to use and enjoy the advantages of another person's property, provided you do not alter or destroy the substance of that property. You are a tenant, not the owner.
Oh, wow.
Kenneth applies this directly to the Sinai covenant. That covenant was structured as a suzerain vassal treaty. In the ancient Near East, a suzerain was a conquering king, and the vassal was the subjugated nation.
Right.
The king dictates the terms of the treaty. The vassal only has the power of consent. They say, "We agree to live by your rules in exchange for your protection." Israel did not own the law. They were supposed to be a kingdom of priests.
And a priest is a mediator, someone who stands between the owner and the rest of the world.
Correct. A priest represents the interests of the property owner to a third party. Israel was given stewardship of the law, the usufruct, so they could demonstrate God's character to the surrounding nations.
Okay, so to build on that property analogy, imagine a massive global corporation, right? And the CEO gives the middle management team a corporate credit card.
Okay.
The managers are supposed to use that card strictly according to the CEO's expense policy to run the business. But instead of managing the account properly, they start acting like they own the company. They change the expense rules, they add their own hidden fees, they buy things the CEO explicitly forbade, and they totally misrepresent the company to the clients.
And what happens when the CEO finds out?
The CEO steps in, confiscates the corporate card, fires the corrupt middle management, and takes over direct management of the accounts. So, according to Kenneth, the new covenant is God eliminating the middleman of human interpretation. By placing my law directly into the heart of the individual, he ensures the output remains pure.
That precisely captures the mechanism Kenneth is describing in these notes.
But that raises a massive question. If the original software, the law, is perfect and it's just getting stripped of the buggy additions, then what exactly makes the new covenant new? Are we just trying the same failed experiment again?
To answer that, Kenneth's charter forces us back to the original languages. We have to look at the philological debate, specifically the difference between the Hebrew word used in the Old Testament and the Greek word used in the New Testament.
Okay, let's dig into the word studies.
In Jeremiah 31.31, which is the foundational prophecy for the New Covenant, the Hebrew word used for new is chadash.
Chadash.
Yes. And chadash primarily means renewed or fresh. It's derived from the root word used to describe the new moon.
Wait, think about that. A new moon isn't a brand new rock that suddenly materialized in the solar system.
No, it's not.
It's the exact same celestial body we've always had, just entering a new cycle. It's restored to its brightness.
Exactly. It is a renewal of the substance within a new framework. Now, Kenneth points out that when we cross over to the New Testament, specifically Hebrews 8.8, which quotes that exact passage in Jeremiah, the Greek word the author uses is kainos.
And there's a big debate about kainos versus another Greek word, right? Neos.
Yes, and the distinction is critical. Neos means new in time. So if you buy a car that just rolled off the assembly line yesterday, that is neos. But kainos means new in nature or new in quality. It implies superiority.
Okay.
According to Kenneth's notes, the covenant is kainos new in quality because its mechanics are superior, not because it introduces a brand new set of rules completely disconnected from the original.
So going back to Hebrews 8.8, does the text actually say what was wrong with the old system?
It does, explicitly. The verse says, "For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant." The text does not say he found fault with the law. The failure was in the people.
Finding fault with them? That is a massive distinction. Like if a parent tells a child, don't touch the hot stove, and the child keeps touching it and getting burned, the parent doesn't say, you know what, the rule is faulty. The rule is abolished. Go ahead and touch the stove.
Right. That would be terrible parenting.
Exactly. They correct the child. The rule is perfect. It's the child's obedience that's broken.
And that leads to the next logical problem Kenneth identifies in the charter.
Yeah.
How do you permanently fix human nature? Because you can't just tell a carnal, fleshly mind to try harder.
Right, because the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8.7 that the carnal mind is enmity against God. It is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. It's not just stubborn, it literally lacks the capacity to run the software.
It is a functional impossibility. And this is where Kenneth argues the new covenant is truly revolutionary. It requires a hardware upgrade, specifically what Colossians 2 calls the circumcision of the heart.
Now, I've always heard that phrase, circumcision of the heart, used in sermons, but usually it's just treated as this poetic metaphor for being a nice person. What do Kenneth's notes say it actually means mechanically?
In the Old Covenant, circumcision was a physical sign of a legal agreement. But in the New Covenant, Kenneth argues it is a mechanical extraction. The notes describe the unregenerate human heart as a stony heart.
Okay.
It is covered by a layer of carnal, fleshly resistance that literally prevents the spiritual law from making contact with the soul.
So it's like a shield.
Yes, you cannot write the law on a heart that is encased in a defensive layer of flesh. Therefore, the new covenant isn't God altering the law, it is God surgically altering the receptor. He extracts the stony heart and installs a heart of flesh, meaning a heart that is soft, pliable, and actually capable of receiving the imprint of his instructions.
Yeah.
It is a literal system override.
Okay, this completely shatters a very popular modern Christian mindset. You hear people quote Psalm 37 all the time, God will give you the desires of your heart.
Oh, yes.
People treat that like God is a cosmic vending machine. My heart desires a promotion or a new house or a Bentley, so God is obligated to give it to me. But based on Kenneth's thesis, that theology is entirely backward.
Kenneth's notes argue that is a profound category error. Think about it mechanically. If the stony heart remains, any desire it produces is inherently corrupted by the flesh. God cannot fulfill those corrupted desires without violating his own holiness.
Because giving a corrupted heart what it wants is just feeding the disease.
Exactly. Kenneth points back to the full conditional formula in Psalm 37. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. First, you must synchronize your joy with his character. When that happens, the heart's desire generator is recalibrated.
Oh, I see. He doesn't give your old carnal heart the things it was asking for. He literally changes the desire generator itself.
Yeah.
He installs new desires so that you organically hunger for what he wants. He gives you the desires by placing them inside you.
Precisely. Kenneth states that the new covenant is not God helping us get what we want. It is God changing us so that we want what he wants. The death of the self is not a religious suggestion in these notes. It is a mathematical necessity for the new hardware to be installed. You obey not out of a terrifying fear of punishment, but out of your very nature.
It becomes who you are.
Right.
Okay, so if the hardware is getting upgraded so it can finally run the original software, we are looking at a renewed covenant, not a brand new religion. But that brings us to an explosive question in Kenneth's notes. Whose hardware is actually being upgraded? Who is this contract legally written for?
This is where the notes really begin to challenge the mainstream historical narrative.
Yeah.
If we adhere strictly to the text of Jeremiah 31.31, the audience is explicitly defined.
What does the text say?
It says, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.
Let me stop you there. Just Israel and Judah.
According to the text, yes.
But wait, where do the Gentiles fit in? Because the standard mainstream narrative is that the Jews rejected Jesus, so God instituted a plan B, abandoned the original plan, and pivoted to the Gentiles to create a completely new entity called the church.
Kenneth's notes firmly reject that Plan B replacement theology. To understand who the Gentiles are in the New Testament letters, Kenneth argues we have to look at a massive historical and legal pivot that occurred centuries earlier, the Bill of Divorcement.
Okay, take us back. When did God issue a divorce?
After King Solomon died, the nation of Israel experienced a brutal civil war. The nation split into two distinct kingdoms.
Right.
The southern kingdom, which retained Jerusalem and the temple, was called Judah. But the northern kingdom, made up of 10 tribes, was called the House of Israel, or sometimes Ephraim, named after its lead tribe.
And the northern kingdom went completely off the rails, right? Like Jeroboam set up the golden calf so the people wouldn't travel back to Judah.
Exactly. They engaged in deep spiritual adultery. They worshipped the idols of the surrounding nations, completely violating that suzerain vassal treaty we talked about. And because of this persistent rebellion, God took a formal legal action against the northern kingdom. Kenneth points to Jeremiah 3.8, where God says, And I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce.
He legally divorced them. That is heavy.
It was a formal severance. Subsequently, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire around 722 BC. And unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, which was later taken to Babylon but largely stayed together and eventually returned, the northern kingdom was scattered entirely into the nations. Legally, God pronounced them lo ami.
Which means...
It's Hebrew for not my people. We see this detailed in the book of Hosea.
Okay, my mind is spinning a bit. If I am tracking with Kenneth's argument here...
Yeah.
Are you saying the Gentiles that the Apostle Paul is writing to in places like Ephesus and Corinth aren't just random ethnically non-Israelite people who decided to adopt a new religion?
Right.
Are they actually the scattered, divorced descendants of the Northern Kingdom who had completely lost their identity?
According to Kenneth's reading of the prophecies and historical data, yes. The notes point to a fascinating prophecy in Genesis 48:1. Jacob is prophesying over his grandson Ephraim, who would eventually lead that northern kingdom. Jacob says Ephraim's seed will become a Melo Hagoyim.
How does that translate?
It translates literally to the fullness of the Gentiles, or the fullness of the nations. Kenneth's argument is that when the northern house was scattered by Assyria, they were systematically sifted among the global populations. Over centuries, they assimilated, they intermarried, they adopted pagan customs.
So over 2,700 years of migration, the literal DNA of the northern house heavily saturated the global population. They became indistinguishable from the other nations.
Exactly. Through biological attrition and cultural assimilation, the seed of the northern house functionally became the Gentiles. Kenneth uses this to recontextualize the words of Jesus in Matthew 15:24. Jesus says, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel."
Wow. Modern readers usually just gloss over that or assume lost sheep is a metaphor for anyone who is lost.
Right, but Kenneth is saying Jesus was stating his specific legal mission objective.
Correct. The claim here is that reaching the Gentiles isn't an afterthought or a plan B. It is a massive, incredibly specific legal rescue mission to recover the divorced, scattered, and amnesiac seed of the northern kingdom. That turns the entire New Testament from the start of a brand new, unrelated religion into a massive family recovery operation.
But hold on. As I'm looking at Kenneth's notes, he brings up a massive legal paradox here.
Oh, the Deuteronomy 24 issue.
Yes. If God issued a formal bill of divorce to the northern kingdom because of their idolatry and they went out and mingled with the nations, how can God just bring them back? Doesn't God's own law, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 24, forbid a husband from remarrying a divorced wife if she has been with other men? Yes, it absolutely does. Deuteronomy 24 creates an impassable wall. The law states that if a man divorces his wife and she goes and becomes another man's wife, the first husband may not take her again to be his wife because she's defiled. It literally says that is an abomination before the Lord.
But God is immutable according to the 13-point charter. He cannot change his character, which means he cannot break his own law. So how does he bring this divorced, defiled northern kingdom back into covenant without violating Deuteronomy 24?
This brings us to what Kenneth describes as the ultimate legal loophole. The Gentilized Israelites were technically under a permanent, irreversible ban. This is why Paul writes in Ephesians 2 that the Gentiles were without hope in the world.
Modern readers think that just means they were sad or lacked spiritual direction.
Right, but Kenneth argues it meant they were legally doomed. There was no path home. The Father's own law stood in the way.
So how is the knot untied? How does God rescue them legally?
Kenneth directs us to Romans chapter 7, where Paul explains the mechanism. Paul begins the chapter by saying, "I speak to them that know the law." He is specifically addressing an audience that understands biblical statutes of marriage and divorce.
Okay.
Paul points out a fundamental legal reality. A woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is legally loosed from the law of her husband.
Oh, wait. The only way the scattered, gentilized northern house could be freed from the Deuteronomy 24 ban, the ban that prevented their return, was if the original husband died.
Precisely. Kenneth's notes argue that this is the legal necessity of the cross. The Messiah, being the Word made flesh, the very manifestation of the God who issued the divorce decree at Mount Sinai, stepped into time and died. His physical death legally terminated the first marriage contract.
Because death breaks the marriage bond.
Yes. And upon his resurrection, he is legally a new husband, initiating a new covenant. And he is now legally free to marry the new woman, which is the restored, purified, and unified house of Israel.
Okay, if this is true, this changes everything about a very famous moment. When Jesus was on the cross, his final words were "Tetelestai," which translates to "it is finished." Almost universally, modern mainstream theology teaches that he meant the 10 Commandments are finished, the law is canceled, we don't have to follow those rules anymore.
Right.
But Kenneth's notes say that in the ancient world, Tetelestai was an accounting and legal term.
Yes, it was an administrative stamp put on paid debts. Kenneth argues that when Jesus said, "it is finished," he was absolutely not announcing the cancellation of the moral law. He was announcing the completion of the legal mechanism, the death of the husband.
The debt of their adultery was paid?
Exactly. The legal hold on the northern house was broken. The old marriage contract that held the divorce decree was legally terminated so the new covenant could begin. Kenneth points out that arguing the moral law was canceled is a massive logical fallacy.
Right, I see his logic here. Because if the moral law is abolished, there is no more sin. Because Paul says in Romans 4:15 that where no law is, there is no transgression. And if there is no more sin, there is no need for a savior. So if Jesus saying, "It is finished," meant the law was gone, he actually rendered his own sacrifice completely useless for anyone born after that day.
It becomes a completely self-defeating theology. Kenneth notes that "it is finished" simply meant the legal obstacle to remarriage was removed. And he uses this to explain the wall of partition Paul talks about in Ephesians 2.
What's the context there again?
Paul says the Messiah abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Mainstream theology assumes ordinances means the Torah, the Ten Commandments, the dietary laws, etc.
Right.
But Kenneth argues that the Greek word for ordinances, dogma, refers to the legal decrees, specifically the decrees of divorce, and the man-made takana we talked about earlier that kept the lo ami, the not my people, out. Christ broke down the legal wall that separated the two divided kingdoms.
Okay, so if the legal barrier of the divorce is removed and the scattered people can come home, what happens when they get there? How do they relate to the house of Judah, the older brother who never got divorced and scattered?
Right.
Kenneth brings up the Apostle Paul's famous analogy of the olive tree in Romans 11. Let's dig into that.
To properly understand Paul's analogy, Kenneth insists we apply the 13-point charter's rule of agricultural realism.
Agricultural realism, okay.
Yeah. In the ancient world, and even today, grafting requires like kind to like kind. You cannot take a branch from a peach tree, graft it onto an olive tree, and expect it to survive. The biology rejects it. Therefore, when Paul speaks of grafting wild olive branches into a cultivated olive tree, the wild branches must be, by definition, olive branches.
So they are Israelite branches.
According to the text, yes. The cultivated tree represents the original covenant-bearing house of Israel, deeply rooted in the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The wild olive branches are the scattered descendants of the northern kingdom who grew up wild in the Gentile forest.
They lost their pruning, they lost their training, they forgot their identity, but their biological and prophetic nature was still olive.
Precisely.
Huh.
And when the gardener, the father, grafts them back into the cultivated tree, they don't change the root. They feed on the original root.
I love this imagery. It's like a massive family estate. The younger brothers rebelled, ran away, and lived as strangers in foreign lands for so long they completely forgot their family name.
Yeah.
They look like foreigners, they talk like foreigners, they act like foreigners. The new covenant is the father sending the son out into the world to find the runaway kids and bring them back to the estate. But here's the critical point. Once they are back in the house, they don't get to say, "Hey, we're Gentiles now, we want a separate set of rules." They live by the exact same house rules as the older brother who stayed home.
That is the essence of what Paul calls the one new man in Ephesians 2. Kenneth's notes argue vehemently against a two-tiered system. The new covenant does not create Jewish Christians who follow the law and Gentile Christians who just need grace.
It's all one house.
Exactly. The theological goal is what the Hebrew scriptures call echad, meaning oneness or absolute unity. Kenneth points to Ezekiel 37, the prophecy of the two sticks. The deity commands Ezekiel to take a stick representing Judah and a stick representing Joseph, meaning Ephraim and the northern house, and join them together in his hand so they become one stick.
So the ultimate endgame of the new covenant is a unified 12-tribe Israel.
Yes. Kenneth notes that when you see the phrase House of Israel in the New Testament, particularly in Hebrews 8, when it describes the implementation of the covenant, it often drops the separate mention of the house of Judah.
Oh, really?
Yes. And the notes argue this isn't because Judah is excluded. It's because the merger has already occurred in the mind of God. If they are echad, they are simply Israel again, fully restored.
Okay, so the family is reunited under one roof. They are all expected to follow the same house rules, the unchanging, immutable law of the father. But how do they actually do it without failing and getting kicked out again like their ancestors did? How do we avoid just repeating the disaster of the old covenant? Kenneth has a section here on what he calls the mechanics of power, mind and heart.
To understand this mechanism, Kenneth states we must first dismantle a very ancient error known as the Marcionite heresy.
I've heard of Marcion. He was an early church figure, right? 2nd century?
Yes. Marcion essentially pitted the Son against the Father. He suggested that the God of the Old Testament was a harsh, legalistic, angry deity, while Jesus came to represent a completely different God, a God of pure love and grace, bringing a nicer set of laws called the law of Christ.
You hear echoes of that all the time today. People will literally say, I don't follow the law of Moses. I follow the law of Christ, which is just to love everyone.
Kenneth's notes assert that this modern mindset is functionally Marcionism, and it creates a schism within the Godhead, violating the principle of Aggadah. Kenneth uses Jesus' own words to destroy this idea. In John 10:30, Jesus says, I and my Father are one. In John 12:49, he says, For I have not spoken of myself, but the Father which sent me, he gave me a commandment, what I should say. And perhaps most importantly, in John 14:15, he says, If you love me, keep my commandments.
So the logical conclusion is that Christ's commandments are the Father's commandments.
Undeniably. According to Kenneth, the law of Christ is not a replacement or a watered-down version of the Father's law. It is the exact same law, translated into human action through the power of love and the Holy Spirit.
I'm trying to think of a mechanical analogy for this. Help me build this out. What if we think of the New Covenant believer like a car?
Okay.
It's a dual input system. You have the mind, which is the written law, the data. Let's call that the steering wheel, and the GPS. It defines objective reality. It tells you right from wrong, what a ditch is, and what the safe road is.
Okay, the structure is sound so far. What is the engine?
The engine is the heart. It's the law of Christ, the internal spirit of love. It provides the power, the propulsion, the desire to move. Now think about it. An engine without a steering wheel is incredibly dangerous. If you just have pure passion and love, but no objective boundaries, you're going to crash into a wall.
Yes, that's lawlessness.
Right. On the other hand, a steering wheel without an engine goes absolutely nowhere. You can have all the rules, all the data, sit in the car and turn the wheel all day, but with no internal power or love, you're just stuck. That's legalism. You need both to actually drive the car.
That is an excellent analogy, and it perfectly mirrors the mathematical formula Kenneth derives from the Apostle John's epistles, specifically 2 John 1:5-6. John explicitly defines love as the action of keeping the commandments. Kenneth sets it up like a math equation. Commandments minus love equals legalism. That was the failure of the Pharisaic system.
They had the steering wheel, but no engine.
Correct. Then love minus commandments equaled lawlessness. That is the failure of modern Marcionism. But commandments plus love equals the true new covenant.
And when you have both, the law isn't this terrible burden anymore. 1 John 5:3 says, For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous.
Kenneth highlights the Greek word used there for grievous.
Yeah.
Balous. It means heavy, burdensome, or oppressive. To an unregenerate, stony heart, the law feels like a crushing weight. It's an external pressure pushing against a resistant surface.
Right.
But to the new circumcised heart, the hardware upgrade we discussed earlier, the law feels like nature. It's an internal impulse.
It's like water to a fish. It's not a burden for a fish to swim. It's the environment it was designed for.
Exactly. For the New Covenant believer, walking in the statutes is a law of liberty.
Okay, I have a major pushback here on behalf of anyone listening who knows their New Testament.
Okay, let's hear it.
Kenneth's thesis sounds incredibly cohesive. God provides the law, he provides the new heart, and he provides the spirit to cause the obedience. It's a closed loop. So, why do the apostles, especially Paul and Peter, seem to argue against the law so aggressively in their letters? Let's look at Acts 15, the famous Jerusalem Council. Peter stands up and literally calls the law an unbearable yoke. If John says the law is not heavy, not berjusa, why does Peter say it's an unbearable yoke? That sounds like a massive glaring contradiction in Kenneth's notes.
Kenneth addresses this head-on in a section dedicated to troubleshooting these textual bugs. He argues that it appears to be a contradiction only if you ignore the historical context of the legal motion on the floor in Acts 15. We have to look at who Peter was arguing against.
Okay, who is the opposition?
The Pharisaic believers. Acts 15:5 says, There rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. But Kenneth points out that their underlying premise was found in verse 1. Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved.
Ye cannot be saved. So they were making obedience to the law the prerequisite for salvation.
Precisely. They were attempting to use the law as a ladder to climb up to salvation. They were using it as a mechanism for justification.
Which doesn't work.
No. Kenneth argues that when you try to use the law to earn salvation, it absolutely becomes an unbearable yoke, because the law demands 100% perfection from a 0% perfect carnal heart. Under that framework, the law isn't just a burden, It is a death sentence.
So Peter wasn't attacking the law itself. He was attacking the misuse of the law.
Exactly. He was rejecting the idea that you can force the software of the law into the old hardware of the unregenerate man to generate the result of salvation. Kenneth outlines the true new covenant order. God grants salvation by grace, upgrades the hardware by giving a new heart, and then installs the software of the law so it can be run properly.
That reframes everything. If Kenneth is right, then we shouldn't be looking at the apostles' letters as abolitionist documents trying to tear down the law. We should look at them as like IT troubleshooting manuals.
That is a very apt description. Kenneth argues that the apostles assumed the Torah was the baseline lifestyle for all believers. But you have to remember, these new congregations were wild.
Yeah.
You had people coming out of deeply pagan, polytheistic backgrounds in places like Corinth, and you had people coming from heavily legalistic, Pharisaic backgrounds in Judea.
And their operating systems were clashing and getting buggy.
Constantly. In Corinth, they were messing up the Passover with class division and drunkenness. Paul didn't write to them and say, you know what, Passover is too hard, it's abolished. He wrote to fix the application of it. He corrected their lack of discernment. When congregations used dietary laws as a point of pride to judge others, Paul wrote to troubleshoot their arrogant hearts, not to delete the dietary software from the system.
Kenneth calls this the one-sided conversation fallacy, right?
Yes. Kenneth argues that the modern church often reads Paul's corrective letters as if he were introducing a brand new law-free theology. We forget we are reading half of a dialogue. We are reading the troubleshooting email, not the original installation manual. The foundational teaching of the law had already been established.
Because if Paul actually meant to abolish the law, he would be in direct defiance of Jesus Christ. Matthew 5:19 is crystal clear. Jesus says, "Till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. And last I checked, I am still standing on the earth, and the sky is still above me."
Indeed. Kenneth's conclusion is that we must read the epistles as instructional manuals for how to properly live out the Father's law through the Spirit of the Son, not as declarations of spiritual anarchy.
Okay, let's bring this down to the individual listener. If obedience to the law isn't how we get saved because we establish that's an unbearable ladder to climb, but it is what we do naturally because we are saved and have the new heart, how does someone actually know they have it?
Right, the proof.
Yeah, because right now, anybody can just stand up and say, oh yeah, I have the new heart, I'm good. Is there a diagnostic test?
Kenneth provides one in his final section, the litmus test of knowledge. And to find the diagnostic criteria, he turns again to the Apostle John. In 1 John chapters 2 and 3, John provides a binary objective test.
What's the test?
1 John 2.4 says, "He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him."
Wow. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't say, well, they're just a struggling Christian in a season of backsliding. He flatly calls them a liar.
It is a definitive, uncompromising diagnostic. Kenneth asserts that for John, knowing God is not an intellectual data point. It is a functional synchronization. If you know the Father, you inherently know his character. His law is the written reflection of his character.
Right.
Therefore, if your life is not characterized by a desire to walk in that law, you haven't actually accessed the data of who he is. You are operating on a false signal.
But Kenneth points out a massive cultural problem here, what he calls a great inversion. In a lot of mainstream religious circles today, if you show a strong desire to objectively obey God's law, say you decide you want to honor the Sabbath, or you start paying attention to biblical dietary laws, you are almost immediately labeled a legalist.
Kenneth's notes dismantle that accusation as a logical absurdity. He asks the reader to trace the logic. If keeping the commandments out of a desire to please God is legalism, then Jesus Christ himself was a legalist because he kept them perfectly.
Exactly.
The apostles were legalists because they commanded others to keep them.
And worst of all, God the Father would be the author of legalism, because his stated goal in Jeremiah 31 is to put the law in our inward parts so we will keep it.
Exactly. Kenneth points out the absolute contradiction. Modern theology suggests that God's ultimate solution for man's failure to keep the law was to create a new covenant, where trying to keep the law is considered a sin. It defies reason.
It's madness. I think the core issue Kenneth is exposing is that modern religion asks a purely subjective question. The question is usually, did you say the sinner's prayer? Do you feel saved in your heart? It's treating salvation like a login password.
You're right.
You type in the right emotional words, and boom, your account is unlocked forever, regardless of what you do on the platform. But John doesn't ask for your subjective feelings. He asks for an objective status report. Are you walking in the Father's instructions? That is the tangible evidence of the new hardware.
And Kenneth brings in Paul to confirm this exact litmus test in 1 Corinthians 7:01. Paul writes, "Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God."
Which is an incredibly bold thing for a former Pharisee to say.
It is. Kenneth emphasizes that Paul is saying your physical pedigree, your status as a Jew or a Gentile, your cultural background, none of that retains value in the new covenant. The only variable that matters is whether your output matches the Father's source code. If the test, which is obedience, is absent, the product, which is salvation, is likely missing. Kenneth concludes that to tell people their desire to obey God is legalism is to actively work against the Holy Spirit's primary objective.
This has been an incredibly heavy, fascinating deep dive. Let me try to objectively summarize Kenneth's entire thesis for the listener.
Please do.
According to this 13-point charter, the law is the unchanging, eternal standard of the Creator. It does not evolve or get canceled. The new covenant is not a change in the rules. It is a hardware upgrade. It's the installation of a new, pliable heart to solve the ancient problem of human failure.
Correct.
We also looked at Kenneth's historical argument that the target audience for this covenant is the reunited, gentilized family of Israel, who had been divorced, scattered, and assimilated into the nations. They were brought back from their global exile by the ultimate legal loophole, the death of the husband, the Messiah, which paid the debt of the divorce decree and satisfied Deuteronomy 24.
Yes, that is the exact legal mechanism Kenneth poses.
And the end result of all of this, if Kenneth is right, is a people who experience joyful obedience. They keep the commandments not out of a terrifying fear of being struck by lightning, but out of love. The law of Christ is the engine driving them to follow the steering wheel of the Father's law.
That is a precise summation of the documents we reviewed today. However, Kenneth's notes leave us with one final reality check, which he calls the not yet factor.
The not yet factor.
Yes. While Kenneth argues the legal contract of the new covenant is signed in the Messiah's blood, and the heart upgrade is currently available to individual believers, the full global implementation of this covenant is still a future event.
Okay.
He points back to Jeremiah 31:34, which explicitly states that when the covenant is fully realized, they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, for they shall all know me.
Well, considering we just spent this entire deep dive teaching this very topic to people, we clearly aren't there yet.
Precisely. Kenneth acknowledges that the very fact this conversation is necessary proves we are still in the installation phase. The kingdom has been initiated, the legal barriers have been removed by the cross, but the global saturation of the new covenant is not yet complete. We live in the tension of the already, but not yet.
So we've looked at the contract through Kenneth's eyes. We've seen an argument that it's not written in invisible ink, that it's written in the unchanging character of God, and that it's meant to be etched into the flesh of a new heart. Think about how you were taught this in Sunday school and compare it to the historical and legal mechanisms we've explored today. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If Kenneth's thesis is true, and the new covenant is simply the Father putting the fish back into the pure water of his law, restoring us to the very environment we were always designed to thrive in, ask yourself, are you fighting the current of his instructions? Are you calling them a burden and an unbearable yoke? Or have you surrendered, let the old stony self die, and allowed the new heart to do exactly what it was designed to do?